Listen, let's move on to Ben Pentreath. It says up there, architectural and interior designer, but he's given me a new name for him, which I'm actually going to use. So he's here because he wrote a piece for the FT, a couple of years ago, called Rent Boy, because he's very delighted at being a private renter. So I remember reading this piece at the time and thinking, who on earth gets to live like this? So get this, Ben gets to live half the week in Bloomsbury, where he rents, and the other half the week in Dorset, in a village in Dorset, is that correct? And the piece in the FT concluded with a line, something along the lines of, if my boiler goes bust, just one phone call to my landlord and everything is sorted out, which is, as well as being a cue for Ben to take the lectern and give us 10 minutes, it does make me wonder, Ben, could you tell us the details of your landlord and give us a number as well?
You wouldn't believe the number of emails that I received after writing that article saying, could you give me the number of your landlord? Which I did to every single person. Then my landlord probably tried to evict me. I'm no expert. I got persuaded into writing a stupid article for a newspaper, and I sort of became a poster child for being a happy renter. And I am somebody who, I could buy a house, I could go out and get a mortgage. I think my issue now is that I'm too old to get a mortgage because I'm well into my 40s, and I've been reading recently that they don't hand out mortgages to people of my age so frequently now because mortgage terms are now about 30 years long, I think, for a lot of people. And they're worried about people still working into their 70s. So I may find that I'm excluded from home ownership in a different way. All I can really offer is, briefly, as I can, a sort of personal story. I last toyed with the idea of buying a house. I was working up in Norfolk for an architect, my first ever job. I think my first salary was £10,000 a year, and I got a massive pay rise to £11,000 a year, and I felt great. And I thought, right, I've really got to get myself onto the property ladder, and I found a random little house in Norfolk, which I could just about afford. And of course, this was a long time ago. I just graduated. Houses in Norfolk were really seriously cheap in those days. It was probably about 40,000 quid or something like that, this little 1 or 2 bedroom house. It was quite nice. It wasn't that great. I remember getting into a huge negotiation with the owner because I was just kind of trying to pitch my offer price, and I knew that all the windows needed replacing, and I was sort of factoring in that. And he was resisting. And while we were in that weird period where you were making the sort of offer, I found myself one evening coming back from a party. I was driving through this village, and I stood in front of the house, this little house. So I got out of the car, and I stood in front of it, and I thought, do I want to be tied to you, the house, for a long time? And I looked at it and I thought, no, I'm just not that interested in fixing my young life to a random little house in a village in Norfolk. And I literally had this sort of vision of, in 30 years' time, I'd still be working for the same boss and sort of talking to the same lady in the village shop and everything. It was all great, but actually I just thought, I'm not ready for this. And it was a sort of mental thing. I just wasn't ready to settle. And it was a good thing, because 6 months later, I decided to up sticks, and I moved, and I got a job in New York. And I loved it so much there that I worked there for about 5 or 6 years. And I moved there in about 1997, 98, and I came back in about 2003. And when I came back, I suddenly realized that I couldn't afford to buy a house in England anymore. And all of my friends from university who had all sort of bought houses in Shepherd's Bush and all of that, and the sort of far outer reaches of London, where you could still afford to buy a house on a reasonable salary in 1998 or 99, they were all sort of telling me, oh my God, it's so amazing, like, I've made £100,000 this year out of my house. And I was thinking, ooh, this is I'm really in trouble now, Of course, that whole delusion came back to bite them when they all got married or had kids, and they needed a bigger house, because the bigger house was now completely out of their own salary reaches, because they were all just working for the BBC or newspapers or whatever they were doing, not high-income people particularly. And suddenly, their only solution to stay on the property ladder was to move further out, another whole zone out, or move to the country, or kind of whatever it is. Or the other solution, which everyone came up with, was to build extensions over their rear garden. So they had the ground floor flat, and they think, great, okay, we're going to extend. And how do we do that? We release equity from our mortgage. So they just borrowed a whole load more money to build an extension covering over the garden at a stroke, removing all over those parts of London sort of smaller houses that people used to be able to afford to buy, because by that stage, everyone was so invested in their bricks and mortar that I looked at all of that and I thought, well, for a start, I can't really afford to get into this. I should start by saying, I've got lovely parents and I love them dearly and they're very supportive of me, but there's not a chunk of cash which is going to kind of arrive in my doorstep when I'm 25 years old to buy a house. And actually, most of my friends who do own houses definitely got there with the support of a big cheque from their parents at a young age. Now, I don't have a problem with that. That's fine, as far as I'm concerned. But that was never on the cards for me. So one of my problems is that I've never been a very good saver. So the thought of saving to build up a deposit when house prices were sort of zooming away quicker than you could blink at them just seemed like a waste of time to me. Like I thought I'd be waiting on that platform for a long time. So I came back from the States and I didn't really know what to do. And I lived with some friends for 3 or 4 months, just in their spare room, which was great, a great experience. But I needed security and I needed my own place and all the rest of it. And I remembered that I had been to a party one evening in a little area of London which I didn't know at all. I'd never been to, sort of tucked away in Bloomsbury, in a beautiful street of Georgian houses called Rugby Street. And it had been given by a friend of mine, and it was his brother's flat. And I'd been there like 5 years before, and I just remembered it was the most amazing street. I'd never seen anything like it. Slightly run down, but in a nice way. Not falling to bits, but just not done up, like the whole of London is now so done up with fancy, everything, Notting Hill. Just quietly, felt a bit unusual. And I called my friend, and I said, didn't you tell me that your brother's landlord was Rugby School? And he said, yeah, no, I'll get the details for you. So I got in touch with this agent who ran Rugby Estate. It turns out that Rugby School, which is that boarding school in Rugby, they have had this estate of probably about 500 houses, and they own all of the shops on Lamb's Conduit Street and Rugby Street. It's a gift. They've had it for 200 or 300 years, a long time. The street is called Rugby Street after the school. And I was put in touch with them, and the agent said, yeah, we've got 12 flats on the books at the moment. Why don't you come around and have a look at them? And most of them were too big, or not what I was after, but there was a couple of little one-bedroom flats which were really nice, and so I did a deal with them. They said, yes, we offer 2-year leases. I wanted to stay there for 2 years. I knew that. And that's how I then started, because at that point I was paying a reasonable rent. It was a good rent for them. It was a good rent for me as well, because I very quickly began to realise that my life, I was living in a perfect area in the centre of London, relatively cheaply, and I could afford to live there. And I realised every time I began, those sort of go out for supper and everyone's like, oh yeah, we've made another 100,000 this year on our house. And I'm like, oh, I'm really doing it wrong. So every now and again, I'd sort of feel guilty about being a tenant, and I'd sort of think, right, I really must go and look at this. And I would start to look in estate agents' windows and just realise that this whole thing was out of it wasn't out of my reach. I could, 10 years ago, have bought into that. But I made a very positive decision that I was living in a great house, had a great landlord, I really liked the street, I could afford to live there, what was not to like? And so that's how I started out. And about 5 years after that, I was doing a lot of work. I do architectural work, and I was doing a lot of work in the West Country. I still do. And I started renting a little house down there, a little flat. And then that grew. From that, I rented a larger house from an estate down in Dorset, which is in a little village. And it's a very weird situation because our landlord, talking of near-feudal situations, it is a feudal situation. He's owned the estate down there, thousands of acres of farmland for about, his family have been there for about 300 years, and they own about 50 houses in this village where we live, and every single house is tenanted. There are no private homeowners in the village at all, which is great, because the one thing none of us ever talk about is house prices, which is a real relief. And when I moved into this house, when I first found this house, it was very run down. It had been through a lot of tenancies and a lot of people who were more interested in, I don't know, hunting or, farming than looking after the building or the garden or whatever. So it got into a bit of a state. And then there had been an empty period where the house had been empty for a year. So it was really there's nothing like an old house being empty for a year for it to begin to fall to bits and talk about mold and damp and all of the other issues. It needed taking into hand. And I said to him, look, I'm happy to put some money into this. I've got a chunk of money in my savings or whatever. I'm happy to put some money into it. I'd like you to put some money in as well. You need to do the landlord improvements. I'll do tenants improvements and make it a bit nicer, put in a nicer bathroom and stuff like that. Can we come to a deal on how much that might be worth to you and me? So he gave me a reduced rent for the first 3 years, and the key thing was that I was able to secure, with negotiation with him, a 10-year lease, because that made it worthwhile for me to invest money in his property. And everyone kept on saying to me, you're just throwing your money away. And I was thinking, well, I sort of am, but on the other hand, I'm living in a beautiful house, which there's no way on earth that I would be able to afford to own. But I can afford to rent it because the rents in the whole place are relatively low. They're much more interested in long-term security and good tenants who are going to care for the place, care for the social aspect of the place, and look after each other than they are in making a quick buck. They made their quick buck 300 years ago, bought a big estate in Dorset. Now they can just sit on it. And there's actually a very benign, benevolent institution, and there are several families in the village who are second or third or fourth generation of mothers and parents and their daughters and sons living in the village, which is a very rare and actually powerful thing in Britain today. And I can't think of many places down in the country where we have that sort of benign sense, because actually I think that the property ownership obsession in the British population has warped those aspects of life. Back in London, after 9 years living in my little one-bedroom flat in Great Ormond Street, having a fantastic time in that little flat, completely out of the blue, I got a phone call from a friend of mine. I know it all sounds a bit matey, but it's just how it happened. She runs an arts institution around the corner on Queen Square called the Art Workers Guild. It was set up in the 1860s. In 1910, they bought a beautiful townhouse in Queen Square, and ever since they've had the building, they've had a rental income stream from the top 3 floors, 2 flats and an office. And Monica called me up and said, the guys have just left the top flat. They'd been there for 10 years. And she said, you might want to come and have a look. And I was like, I've just done it at the bathroom in my flat. I'm really happy. I don't want to move. But I thought, I better go and have a look. So it was an incredible place. I'd never seen anything like it. It was just a great flat in a perfect square in London, and I leapt at it. So some friends of mine moved into my flat. I moved up the road. And again, that flat had been severely underinvested over the years. I think the bathroom was 30 years old or whatever. And so I did exactly the same deal, a long tenancy, and I put in quite a lot of money, and the landlord put in quite a lot of money as well. We did the whole place up. And drawing from these strands, I've My personal experience is extremely fortunate. I'm very conscious that it's completely different from the horrific experience which we've just been hearing about. If you were trying to abstract it into policy terms, I have security. In Dorset, we have a 10-year lease, which every 5 years I can renew. So I know now that I'm there for the next 10 years. I've just renewed it, and in 5 years' time, I can do it again. And if he wants the house back, it is his house after all. Like, it's not actually my house, and I think that's one of the things which is important to remember. I have landlords who paid off the mortgage hundreds of years ago. That they're not trying to treat me as a pension fund investment. They want me to be a good, steady, safe return, which I am. I look after the place, both places. They love that. I love them. I love both houses. And I'm not being treated like I'm sort of, having the pip squeezed out of me. And I look at people, sort of my friends, in huge mortgages these days relative to their income. I look at the actual cost of owning, quote unquote, a house, and I think that the banks really own it. It's the mortgage companies who really own it. I had a very quick look on a little mortgage calculator on the way down. Barclays mortgage calculator just typed in, if you wanted to borrow £500,000 on their current interest, which is crazily low, 1.6%, per month over a 30-year, you're paying £1,760 a month, which amounts to 633,000 quid at the end of it, assuming that for the next 30 years, interest rates don't rise, which would be a very, very foolish assumption given the economy. So you might be arguing that over the life of a normal mortgage, they might be paying back £900,000 to borrow £600,000 in the first place. So you better hope at the end of the period that your mortgage that your house is worth £1 million, because that's what you've spent on it. And I think if you can get yourself away from the sort of obsession about owning a house as being good value for money and open up renting into a long-term benign relationship, and I think the way to do it is, I was appalled to hear the number of private single landlords. That's the fundamental crux of the matter for me. I don't know how it's going to happen. We were chatting about it before. Is it pension funds, who are people who have huge resources and want long-term return? That's where the thing has got to be unlocked. Ben,
thanks a lot for saying all that. But listening to you, it's obvious that you've got a very enviable life. You go to parties, suppers, you never save. I wish I could do all of those things. I did wonder when I was listening to you, though, obviously your situations are really very good for you. But one of the powerful words that came out of Rosie's talk was this thing about power. I don't have the same say as the guy or woman who owns my property. Do you not feel any of that chafing upon you ever? Well, You could be turfed out.
I could be turfed out in 10 years' time. I have a 10-year lease.
They could refuse to go along with your schemes for redesigning the house, if they,
Yeah. In both cases, I'm allowed to do what I want, but I have to paint it white at the end of the tenancy if they ask me to. Well, that's fine. I'll paint it white. That whole thing about decorating your house and stuff like that, it's sort of like people say, oh, God, you're throwing money away. And I'm like, well, why did he go and eat in that restaurant? Or why did he go on that holiday? It's over in a week. I want a nice house. I'm going to live there every night, every day. What's wrong with spending a bit of money on that, if you see what I mean? But the power, clearly money buys power, doesn't it? It always did. It probably always will. I don't have that money. I don't have a huge chunk of money. So I guess that ultimately in a power game, they would come down to it. They own the building. They can do what they like with it. Within reasons. I am there for 7 years, so that's quite. That's as powerful as I'm happy with that. I think you'd be happy with that, right? And that's what you were sort of saying. Why don't we move on?
Come back.
Because I've been here for a long time. Sit down.